Prague, 1943. In a confessional booth at the Church of St. Wenceslas on Bredovsky Street, where the murmur of prayers sometimes mixed with the distant shouts of German commands, a 50-year-old priest named Antonin Prohalska sat in the darkness and made a decision that could see him executed by morning. He was graying, sturdy-handed from years of manual work, and to the SS officers who occasionally nodded to him on the street, he was simply the harmless old clergyman who kept his church orderly. But every day when he climbed the stone steps to his pulpit and looked out the window at the SS regional headquarters directly across the narrow cobblestone street, he carried a secret that would mean immediate arrest and torture. He was systematically moving people marked for death out of Prague and towards safety. Not just a few individuals, not merely the occasional fugitive. We are talking about an underground network that would ultimately guide more than 300 people through occupied territory, each one a name on a Gestapo list waiting to be crossed off, each one representing a human being marked for deportation, interrogation, and almost certain death in the camps. And he made them vanish as if they had never existed. The SS headquarters was not just any building. This was the administrative center of Nazi control in the district, the place where decisions about arrests and deportations were made with bureaucratic precision. Every morning brought the sound of boots on cobblestone, staff cars arriving and departing, typewriters clicking behind blackout curtains. The acrid smell of coal smoke from the building's furnaces mixed with the incense that drifted from Father Antonin Prohalska's church across the street, two institutions separated by 50 meters of pavement and an unbridgeable moral chasm. Father Antonin Prohalska worked in the spiritual care of his parish, a position that gave him access to something the Nazis had not anticipated as dangerous: trust. The confessional booth, the baptismal font, the funeral rites, these were not just religious ceremonies, they were opportunities. Every confession might be a plea for help. Every baptism might require forged documentation. Every funeral might involve moving someone who was very much alive. His job was to shepherd souls towards salvation. The Nazis never imagined he would take that mission quite so literally. He was supposed to be a representative of a church that had made its accommodations with power, that had chosen institutional survival over confrontation. But Father Antonin Prohalska was not what he seemed. Born in 1993 into a family of Czech nationalists in a nation that had spent centuries under foreign rule, he had watched his country briefly taste independence after the Great War, only to be swallowed again by a greater darkness. By 1939, when German tanks rolled into Prague and the swastika was raised over Hatransky Castle, he understood that neutrality was not an option his conscience would permit. But he also knew that open resistance meant death and the destruction of any capacity to help. So he did something that required a particular kind of courage. He would use his position as a priest, with all the protections and access it provided, to sabotage the machinery of genocide from within. He wanted to be where the hunted came for sanctuary, where medieval architecture offered possibilities the occupiers had not considered, where his collar could serve as both a shield and a weapon. His plan required nerves of steel and a willingness to live a split existence. He would maintain his duties, earn the tolerance if not the trust of the occupation authorities, and then systematically betray everything they represented. When he began his work in late 1941, even members of the scattered Czech resistance thought the proximity to SS headquarters was impossibly dangerous. They were wrong. He had found the perfect paradox. The last place the hunters would look for prey was in the shadow of their own den. The system was supposed to be inescapable. The Nazis had blanketed Prague with checkpoints, informant networks, identification controls, and the constant threat of random searches. The Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia prided itself on order, on the idea that no enemy of the Reich could move through the streets without leaving traces. But Father Prochaska understood something that the SS officers across the street, confident in their power, had overlooked. The system only worked if every institution cooperated, and the Church occupied a unique space of cautious autonomy. The Nazis were willing to persecute clergy when necessary, but they also understood that wholesale attacks on religious institutions could turn passive populations into active resistors. It was a narrow seam in the armor of occupation, and Father Prochaska intended to exploit it until it tore wide open. His method combined medieval infrastructure with modern deception. Beneath the church of St. Wenceslas lay a network of tunnels and crypts dating back centuries, passages that connected to cellars, to the old sewage systems, to buildings the Nazis had catalogued but not fully understood. He would use funeral rites to move the living in coffins, confession sessions to conduct intake interviews, baptismal records to create false identities. The risk was calculated but enormous. The Gestapo maintained internal security units whose sole function was to identify resistance activities. One suspicious neighbor reporting unusual foot traffic at the church could trigger surveillance. One collaborator in the network could unravel the entire operation. One German officer deciding to inspect the crypts could mean immediate discovery. If caught, there would be no trial, no mitigation, no appeal to religious protection. He would be taken to Pankratz prison, interrogated until he revealed every name in his network, and then executed. His parishioners would be arrested. His fellow priests would face investigation. The penalty for what Father Prochaska was doing was not simply his own death, but the potential annihilation of everyone connected to him. And yet, every single day he woke in his modest quarters, dressed in his black cassock, and walked to his church while SS officers across the street began their shifts. Every single day he committed acts that violated every law of the occupation, while those same officers sometimes stopped to exchange pleasantries about the weather. The most isolating aspect was not the constant danger of discovery. It was the enforced silence. Father Prochaska could not share the full scope of his work to anyone, not to most of his fellow clergy, not to his family, not even to all his resistance contacts. The architecture of his network depended on compartmentalization. Most participants knew only their specific role, never the complete picture. So he lived a division so complete that it marked him visibly to those who looked closely. At church functions, he maintained cordial relations with Czech officials serving the occupation, shared meals with parishioners who believed he was simply performing his pastoral duties, and conducted Mass with steady hands. At night, he lay awake in the darkness, going over every detail of operations planned for the following day, wondering if he had chosen correctly which family to move first, whether tomorrow would be the day someone noticed an inconsistency in a forged document, whether tomorrow would be the day a Gestapo car stopped outside his church and officers climbed the steps toward his door. But he continued because somewhere in Prague, in the countryside beyond, eventually across the border into relative safety, there were people whose names had been on lists, whose addresses had been marked for raids, who were still breathing and free because a priest had decided that his vows demanded more than prayer. He continued because across the narrow street, in that building where bureaucrats administered murder with forms and stamps, they had made one crucial miscalculation. They had assumed that a man of God would choose his own survival over the difficult commands of conscience. The year 1943 marked a shift in both the war and the intensity of persecution in Prague. The Wehrmacht was suffering catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front, with entire armies encircled and destroyed in the Russian winter. The triumphant predictions of quick victory had dissolved into grinding attrition. But even as military fortunes deteriorated, the Nazi regime intensified its focus on what it termed internal enemies. Heinrich Himmler and other architects of genocide believed that Jews still evading deportation, resistance cells operating in the shadows, and dissidents undermining morale were somehow responsible for military setbacks rather than accepting the consequences of their own strategic failures. This meant one thing for Father Prochaska: accelerating danger and escalating need. The SS regional headquarters across from his church was not reducing operations, it was expanding them. More raids, more arrests, more names added to deportation lists. The Gestapo was drowning in denunciations. Informants were everywhere in occupied Prague. A neighbor reporting someone for listening to BBC broadcasts, a business rival accusing a competitor of black market trading, a jilted lover claiming someone had made anti-German remarks. Every denunciation generated paperwork, and every piece of paperwork eventually translated into a knock on a door in the early morning hours. The traffic arriving at SS headquarters included dossiers on resistant suspects, updated lists of Jews who had evaded previous roundups, reports on clergy considered politically unreliable, and files on Czechs whose nationalism made them security risks. Father Prochaska's parish was swimming in people whose names appeared in those files, people who understood that time was running out, that the net was tightening, that their only chance was to disappear before the knock came. The traffic through his confessional booth increased. The desperate whispers became more frequent, the calculations more brutal. 3 families seeking escape, resources to move only 2. The moral mathematics that would haunt Father Prochaska until his final day. By what authority does one choose who lives and who waits, knowing that waiting might mean death? But even as the danger multiplied, even as the SS officers across the street became more vigilant and the random checkpoints more frequent, Father Prochaska made a decision that defined his character. He would not reduce operations to protect himself. He would accelerate them. If the risks were growing, then the urgency was growing as well. Every day he delayed might be the day someone on his waiting list was arrested. Every moment he prioritized caution over action was a moment someone spent in mortal danger. His network expanded. The tunnel system was mapped more thoroughly. The forging operation in the church basement became more sophisticated. The safe house network across Prague grew to more than 50 civilians willing to harbor fugitives for 48-hour intervals. And his most audacious innovation, disguising escapees as visiting clergy from rural parishes, providing them with cassocks and collars, walking them through checkpoints where German soldiers would nod respectfully to men and women they assumed were servants of God making pastoral visits. It was brilliant, it was effective, and it could not last forever. Because across that narrow cobblestone street, in offices where every detail was recorded and cross-referenced, someone would eventually notice an anomaly. A file that should exist but doesn't, a pattern that seems irregular, a priest whose church seems to attract an unusual amount of nighttime traffic. The question was never whether Father Prochaska would be caught. The question was only how many people he could save before that inevitable morning arrived. Antonín Procházka learned about resistance before he learned about theology. His father had been a printer in Prague who produced Czech-language pamphlets during the Austro-Hungarian Empire, when their language itself was an act of defiance. His mother taught him that the Czechs had survived centuries of foreign rule, not through military might, but through stubborn persistence, through keeping their identity alive in kitchens and churches while empires rose and fell around them. When young Antonín announced at 17 that he intended to enter the seminary, his father had asked only one question: will you use it to hide from the world or to change it? He chose the priesthood not as retreat, but as vocation. The church, he understood, occupied a unique position in Czech society. It predated the current occupation, and it would survive whatever came next. Priests heard confessions, witnessed births and deaths, moved through communities with a freedom that ordinary citizens did not possess. By 1941, when he was assigned to the Church of St. Wenceslas in Bredovsky Street in Prague, Father Procházka was 48 years old, his hair showing silver at the temples, his hands calloused from years of maintaining church buildings himself rather than hiring workers he could not afford. He was known for his quiet sermons and his willingness to listen more than he spoke. The German occupation had turned Prague into a city of whispers and absences. Friends disappeared overnight. Families that had lived in apartments for generations were suddenly gone, their possessions distributed or claimed by the state. The synagogues stood empty or converted to warehouses. Czech universities were closed. The language his parents had fought to preserve was being displaced by German on every official sign and document. But Father Procházka, like many clergy, maintained a careful neutrality. He conducted Mass,
heard confessions, performed baptisms and funerals. He nodded politely when SS officers passed his church. He told himself that survival meant being able to help his parishioners navigate impossible times, that preserving the institution meant he could continue to offer what faith provided. September 1941 shattered that careful accommodation. Father Prohaska was in his study when he heard shouting from the street. He moved to the window and saw Gestapo officers surrounding the apartment building across from his church. They emerged minutes later with the Steiner family, Czech Jews who had lived in the neighborhood for 2 generations. There were arrests happening across Prague daily, but this one unfolded directly in his line of sight. The family was loaded into a covered truck. As the vehicle prepared to pull away, Father Prohaska found himself moving towards the church entrance, though he had no plan, no words prepared. He reached the street just as the truck began to pull away. Through the gaps in the canvas covering, he could see faces pressed against the opening, and for a brief moment, his eyes met those of the family's youngest member. There was no plea in that gaze, no expectation of rescue, just a witnessing, a silent acknowledgement that he was there, watching, doing nothing. The truck turned the corner and disappeared. Father Prohaska stood on the cobblestones, his cassock stirring in the autumn wind, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. He had told himself that neutrality was wisdom, that preserving the church's position meant being able to help more people in small ways. But standing there in the aftermath of what he had just witnessed, he understood that neutrality was simply another word for complicity. That night, after evening prayers, Father Prohaska descended into the church crypts with an oil lamp. The medieval chambers beneath St. Wenceslas had been built centuries ago, used originally for burials and storage. He had been down there dozens times, but he had never looked at them strategically. Now he moved through the stone passages with different eyes, noting the sealed doorways that suggested tunnels extending beyond the church foundation, the heavy wooden doors that could be barred from inside, the multiple chambers that could be used for concealment. He spent 3 hours mapping what he could reach, estimating what might be possible. The next morning, he sent a carefully worded message through a parishioner he trusted, asking to speak with someone connected to the scattered Czech resistance networks he knew existed but had never contacted. The response came 2 days later. A man appeared at confession and spoke through the latticed screen. "Here," he said, "I hear you have questions about your church's history."
Father Prohaska took a breath, counted to 3, and made the choice that would define the rest of his life. "I have tunnels," he said quietly, "and I want to learn how to use them." The tunnels beneath St. Wenceslas proved more extensive than Father Prohaska had initially understood. With help from a resistance contact who provided him with city archives dating to the medieval period, he discovered that his church sat atop a network originally built from moving supplies during the Hussite Wars of the 15th century. Over the following months, working only at night with Jan Kovács, the church sacristan who had maintained the building for 30 decades, they mapped passages that connected to 4 separate buildings within 2-block radius: a residential apartment cellar, a shuttered bookshop, a warehouse currently being used for storing confiscated goods, and most remarkably, an exit point in the sewage system that opened near the Vltava River. The work was physically demanding and dangerous. Sections of tunnel had collapsed over centuries. Others were partially flooded or blocked with debris. Father Prohaska and Jan Kovács worked with hand tools, clearing passages, shoring up weakened areas with timber, creating concealed doorways that would appear to casual inspection as nothing more than bricked-over archways. They wore civilian clothes during this work, keeping buckets of water nearby to wash away the dust and mud before returning to street level. The sacristan, a taciturn man in his 60s with steady hands and an absolute commitment to discretion, never asked unnecessary questions. He simply did what needed doing. But infrastructure alone was insufficient. Father Prohaska needed a system for identifying who genuinely needed help versus who might be a Gestapo infiltrator.
a method of producing the documentation that would allow people to move through checkpoints, and above all, trusted individuals who could operate the various elements without compromising the entire network if one person was arrested. The confession protocol emerged from necessity. Anyone who sought help would come to confession during designated hours, Tuesdays and Thursdays afternoons. They would use a specific phrase, "Father, I have strayed from the path and cannot find my way home." This signaled their need. Father Prochazka would conduct a genuine confession first, both for authenticity and because some who came truly needed spiritual counsel before attempting an escape that might fail. Then he would ask specific questions, delivered as spiritual guidance, but designed to verify their story and assess risk. Only after this screening would he provide instructions for the next step. The forgery workshop required specialized skills. Through resistance contacts, Father Prochazka was introduced to Dr. Emil Kratochil, a chemist whose university position had been eliminated under the occupation. Dr. Kratochil had the technical knowledge to age paper properly, to reproduce the specific inks used in official German documents, to understand which stamps and seals would be examined most carefully at checkpoints. He set up his workspace in the church basement behind a false wall constructed to look like storage for vestments and ceremonial items. His tools fit into 2 small cases that could be hidden within minutes if necessary. He worked with precision born from scientific training, understanding that a single error in paper composition or ink formulation could mean the difference between someone passing through a checkpoint or being arrested on the spot. The final member of the core team was Sister Magdalena, a nun in her 40s who had been nursing wounded Czech soldiers since the beginning of the occupation. She possessed both medical knowledge and a remarkable talent for reading people, for sensing when someone is concealing information or when fear might cause them to panic at a critical moment. She became the network's intake coordinator, meeting with those who passed Father Prochazka's initial screening, assessing their physical condition, explaining the risks explicitly, and preparing them psychologically for what escape would require. These 4 people, the priest, the sacristan, the chemist, and the nun, formed the operational center of what they never gave a formal name. They met once a week in the church crypts, reviewing current cases, discussing problems, adjusting methods based on what they learned from each operation. They established one absolute rule: compartmentalization. The safe house operators who harbored escapees for brief intervals never knew about the tunnels. The guides who moved people between locations never knew about the forgery workshop. No single person outside their core group understood the complete system. By early 1942, the network was operational. If you appreciate these untold stories, please like and subscribe. It helps us continue this work.
The most difficult part of Father Prochazka's work was not the danger of the operations themselves, but the performance required between them. Every morning, he awoke, dressed in his cassock, and walked to his church, while across the narrow street, SS officers arrived for their shifts at the regional headquarters. Some mornings they nodded to him. He nodded back. The gesture cost him nothing physically, but the accumulation of such moments created a weight that pressed against his chest like a stone. The protectorate authorities expected clergy to maintain at minimum a posture of cooperation. Father Prochazka attended civic ceremonies when required, standing among other religious and community leaders while German officials spoke about the new order and the benefits of Reich protection. He kept his face carefully neutral during these events, applauding politely when others applauded, never giving cause for anyone to report him as hostile or uncooperative. Each performance felt like a small betrayal, even as he understood intellectually that these appearances were precisely what allowed him to continue his actual work. The most challenging test came in March 1942, when Hauptsturmführer Rudolf Bauer, deputy commander of the SS regional office, requested a meeting to discuss church maintenance. Father Prochazka received the summons with carefully controlled calm. He crossed the street at the appointed hour, was ushered past guards into an administrative office that smelled of cigarette smoke and floor polish, and sat across a desk from an officer whose uniform was immaculate and whose questions were precise.
Bauer expressed concern about structural integrity of older buildings in the district. There had been incidents, he explained, of cellars collapsing, of old tunnels becoming hazards. His office was conducting a survey of medieval structures. Would Father Prochaska consent to having the church crypts inspected to ensure safety? Father Prochaska felt his heartbeat accelerate, but kept his voice steady. He explained that the church had maintained its own assessment of structural soundness, that the crypts were used only for storage of ceremonial items and historical records, that allowing secular authorities into sacred spaces raised questions of ecclesiastical jurisdiction that would require consultation with higher church officials. He delivered this explanation with the measured tone of a man concerned primarily with protocol rather than concealment. Bauer listened, made notes, and then smiled slightly. "Of course, Father, we respect the Church's autonomy in such matters. I merely wanted to ensure there were no hazards." He paused, and then added, "I must say your church is admirably maintained. Such orderliness is rare in these times. It reflects well on your stewardship." Father Prochaska accepted the compliment with a small nod, thanked the Hauptsturmführer for his concern, and was dismissed. He walked back across the street at a measured pace, entered his church, and only when he reached the privacy of his study did he allow himself to lean against the wall, breathing deliberately until his hands stopped shaking. The encounter had been a warning, or a test, or simply bureaucratic routine. He could not be certain which, and the uncertainty was its own form of torment. Sister Magdalena noticed the toll during one of their weekly meetings. "You look exhausted," she said quietly. "I'm managing," he replied. She studied him for a long moment. "The performance is sometimes harder than the work itself." He nodded, grateful that someone understood without requiring explanation. The devil across the street was not simply the SS headquarters or the officers within it. The devil was the necessity of maintaining a facade so complete that he sometimes feared losing track of which version of himself was the performance and which was the truth.
The moment Father Prochaska had dreaded arrived in May 1942. Within a single week, 3 separate families came to confession using the designated phrase. Each was in immediate danger. Each had compelling reasons why delay meant death. And Father Prochaska had resources, safe houses, forged documents, and guides available for only 2 families. The first family consisted of a husband and wife, both academics, whose names had appeared on deportation lists. They had already received preliminary notices and had perhaps 3 days before the final summons arrived. The second was a Jewish family, whose apartment building was scheduled for a systematic sweep the next week. The third included an elderly couple and their adult daughter, resistance sympathizers, whose neighbor had denounced them for listening to BBC broadcasts. The Gestapo had already questioned them once. Father Prochaska sat in his study with the intake information Sister Magdalena had prepared. 3 sets of papers representing 3 groups of human beings whose survival now depended on his decision. He had no good criteria for choosing. Medical vulnerability? The elderly couple had health issues that would make the journey difficult. Immediacy of threat? The academics faced arrest within days. Likelihood of successful escape? The younger families had better chances of surviving the physical demands of moving through the network. He prayed for guidance and received only silence. He consulted with Sister Magdalena, who listened carefully and then said what he already knew. There is no right answer. There is only the decision you can live with. Father Prochaska chose the academics and the Jewish family. His reasoning, as such it was, came down to timing and deportation risk. The third family faced interrogation and possible imprisonment, but they were not yet on immediate transport lists. He told himself he could move them the following week, that delay was not the same as abandonment. He was wrong. 2 days after the academics and the Jewish family successfully moved through the first stage of extraction, the Gestapo returned to question the elderly couple this time. They brought arrest warrants. The family was taken to Pankratz prison. Father Prochaska learned of it from a parishioner who had witnessed the arrest.
He sat in the empty church that evening, staring at the altar, and felt the weight of his decision settle into his bones like a permanent ache. He had chosen, they had died. The mathematics were that simple and that devastating. That night, Father Prochaska began keeping a ledger. He used a simple substitution code, replacing names with saints' names, dates with liturgical references, locations with biblical places. To anyone finding the notebook, it would appear to be sermon notes and theological reflections. To Father Prochaska, it was an accounting of souls, the saved in one column, the lost in another. Those still waiting marked with a symbol that meant his protection had not yet reached them. The ledger became both record and penance. Each week he added entries, marking successful extractions with precise notation, recording those who had been arrested before he could help them. He included the family he had chosen not to save in that initial impossible decision. He wrote their names in code and marked them with a small cross. He would not allow himself to forget them or to pretend that someone else bore the responsibility for the choice. The arithmetic of salvation became his constant companion. Every decision about resource allocation, every choice about timing, every assessment of risk carried the knowledge that choosing one person meant another would wait. Sometimes waiting meant survival until resources became available. Sometimes it meant arrest in the interim. Father Prochaska learned to live with this calculation, but he never accepted it. The distinction mattered to him, though he could not fully articulate why. Sister Magdalena found him one evening working on the ledger by candlelight. She saw enough to understand what he was doing. "You cannot carry all of them," she said gently. "I must carry the ones I could not save," he replied. "If I forget them, if I allow myself to think only of the successes, then I lose something essential. I become someone who can make these choices without cost." She placed a hand on his shoulder, but said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. The arithmetic would continue as long as the network operated, and Father Prochaska would continue recording it, counting both the saved and the lost, refusing to grant himself the comfort of forgetting either.
The idea came to Father Prochaska at an actual funeral in March 1942, as he watched German soldiers step aside respectfully while a coffin passed through a checkpoint on Wenceslas Square. Death, he realized, was one of the few things the Nazis still treated with a measure of caution, not out of compassion, but superstition and the practical desire to avoid disease. A funeral procession moved through Prague with an authority that living people no longer possessed. Within a week, he had commissioned Jan Kovar, his sacristan and a former carpenter, to modify 3 coffins in the church basement. The modifications were precise. Air holes disguised as decorative brass fittings along the sides, interior padding to muffle any sound, and a false bottom that could hold forged documents. The coffins were designed to pass the most cursory inspection while keeping their occupants alive for the 2-hour journey from the church to the safe house network on Prague's outskirts. Dr. Kratovil prepared mild sedatives, enough to keep someone calm and quiet, but not so much they would fail to respond if discovered and questioned. The dosage had to be perfect. Too little and panic could betray them, too much and they risked actual death, transforming their deception into a genuine tragedy. The first trial came on a cold April morning. Sarah Levy, a young woman whose entire family had been transported the month before, lay in the coffin with her eyes closed, breathing slowly through the concealed vents. Father Prochaska led the procession with Sister Magdalena and 4 trusted parishioners acting as mourners. They moved through the streets with practiced grief, their prayers genuine even as their purpose was subterfuge. At the checkpoint on Jinderske Street, a young Wehrmacht soldier raised his hand. "Halt! Papers!" Father Prochaska produced the death certificate, forged by Dr. Kratovil with official stamps acquired through the resistance. The soldier examined it, then looked at the coffin with sudden suspicion. "Open it."
Time compressed into a single, terrible moment. Father Prochaska felt his heart hammering against his ribs, but his voice remained steady, almost gentle. "My son, this woman died of typhus 3 days ago. The body is still contagious. For your safety, I said open it." The soldier's hand moved towards his rifle. Father Prochaska stepped closer, lowering his voice to a tone of pastoral concern that carried just the right mixture of authority and sympathy. "I have performed the last rites over many bodies, soldier. I have seen what typhus does, the discoloration, the smell. If you require this, I will open it, but I must insist you stand back at least 3 meters. The disease spreads through the air from corpses. I would not want to write to your mother explaining how your son died." The soldier's face paled. Behind him, an older Feldwebel approached, glanced at the papers, then at the priest's collar. "Let them pass. We have no orders to inspect religious burials." He pulled the younger soldier back. "You want to catch typhus over paperwork?" The procession moved forward. Father Prochaska did not allow himself to exhale until they were 2 streets away. Inside the coffin, Sarah Levy remained perfectly still, the sedative keeping her calm even as she heard every word of the confrontation above her. By summer, the funeral processions had become their most reliable extraction method. Father Prochaska conducted an average of 3 burials per week, each one carrying a living person towards safety while German soldiers stepped aside and made the sign of the cross.
The message arrived on December 21st, 23, hidden inside a prayer book left in the confessional. Father Prochaska's hands trembled as he decoded the penciled dots along Psalm 91. Christmas Eve, ghetto remnant, all remaining. The SS planned to empty what little remained of Prague's ghetto quarter during midnight mass, when most Czechs would be in churches, when the streets would be quiet, when witnesses would be few. The symbolism was deliberate, a final erasure timed to the holiest night of the Christian calendar. Father Prochaska had 72 hours to coordinate the largest rescue operation his network had ever attempted. 27 people needed to disappear simultaneously. 27 from the ghetto district, 10 from surrounding safe houses that were no longer secure. The logistics were staggering. Multiple extraction points, multiple routes, multiple coffins, forged papers, safe houses on the city's edges, and a freight connection that would move them toward the protectorate border. He called an emergency meeting in the crypts with his core team. Sister Magdalena would coordinate the safe houses. Jan Kovar would prepare 8 coffins and arrange the funeral processions. Dr. Kratochvil would handle the medical needs and sedatives. Each person understood the arithmetic. If one element failed, the entire operation collapsed, and everyone would face execution. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow covering Prague's cobblestones. The church of St. Wenceslas filled early for midnight mass, families bundled in their heaviest coats, children clutching candles, the air thick with incense and nervous energy. Father Prochaska stood at the altar in his vestments as parishioners filed into pews, while in the crypts below, 17 people waited in darkness. The plan required precise timing. The Mass would last 90 minutes. During the congregation's hymns, when voices were loudest, small groups would descend to the crypts through the sacristy door. They would move through the tunnel system to 4 different exit points, emerging in locations where coffins and funeral processions waited. The multiple extractions happening simultaneously would make it harder for patrols to connect them as a coordinated operation. Father Prochaska began the liturgy with steady hands, though his mind tracked every movement behind him. During the 3rd hymn, he saw Sister Magdalena nod from the side aisle. The first group was descending. During the gospel reading, Jan Kovar's absence from his usual position confirmed the second wave had begun. Then Father Prochaska's blood froze.
In the rear pew, partially obscured by shadows, sat SS Obersturmbannführer Heinrich Geschke in civilian clothes. He was not praying. He was watching, counting. His eyes moved methodically across the congregation, studying faces, noting movements. Father Prochaska's voice nearly faltered on the Eucharistic prayer, but decades of ritual memory carried him forward. He could not signal the warning, could not stop the operation mid-execution, could only continue the Mass while 27 lives moved through the darkness below, unaware they were being observed from above. The consecration, the communion, the final blessing. Father Prochaska's eyes never left Geschke, who remained seated even as the congregation filed out into the snowy night. When the last parishioner left, Geschke stood, walked slowly down the center aisle, and stopped directly before the altar. A beautiful Mass, Father, such devotion, though I noticed several empty seats tonight. Unusual for Christmas, wouldn't you say? Father Prochaska met his gaze without flinching. The occupation has scattered many families, Obersturmbannführer. Not everyone can travel safely for the holidays. Geschke held his stare for 5 eternal seconds, then nodded slowly. Indeed. Good night, Father. We will speak again soon. The operation had succeeded. All 27 had escaped. But Father Prochaska knew the investigation had begun.
The new year brought a cold that settled into Prague's bones and refused to leave. It also brought systematic pressure that Father Prochaska recognized as the tightening of a noose. In the first week of January 1944, Gestapo agents conducted random searches of 3 buildings within 2 blocks of St. Wenceslas Church. They found nothing. The safe houses had been evacuated immediately after Christmas, but the message was clear. Someone was mapping the network's geography, testing its boundaries, watching for reactions. On January 12th, the Dvorak apartment on Milantrakova Street was raided at dawn. The family had sheltered 2 escapees the month before, though the apartment was empty when the Gestapo arrived. They arrested Pan and Pani Dvorak anyway, dragging them to Pechakarna prison for interrogation. 3 days later, the Baranek house on the city's edge was similarly compromised. The couple disappeared into Theresienstadt. Father Prochaska received the news during evening prayers, and for the first time in 3 years, his hands shook visibly as he held the rosary. 2 families arrested, 2 points of contact exposed. The question that haunted him through sleepless nights: had they revealed anything under torture? Did the Gestapo now have names, locations, methods? He stopped going home to the small rectory apartment beside the church. Instead, he slept in the sacristy on a narrow cot, fully dressed, ready to destroy documents and flee through the tunnels at the first sound of boots on cobblestones. Sister Magdalena brought him meals he barely touched. The brandy he kept for sick parishioners became a nightly companion, though he never drank enough to dull his vigilance. Just enough to quiet the litany of names cycling through his mind. Dvorak, Baranek, Steiner, Levy, the saved and the lost, blurring together. He instituted new protocols: no meetings without at least 2 witnesses present. All communications passed through multiple intermediaries. The tunnel entrances were modified with collapse mechanisms that could be triggered to prevent pursuit. He was transforming from a priest into something harder, more suspicious, less human. Then, on January 28th, František Novak appeared. He came during morning mass, waiting until the church emptied before approaching the altar. Mid-30s, unremarkable features, wearing the threadbare coat common to half of Prague. He introduced himself as a courier from the resistance cell in Vinohrady, carrying a verbal message from someone Father Prochaska knew by reputation but had never met. The message was legitimate enough: details about German troop movements that matched intelligence Father Prochaska had received from other sources,
but something in Novak's manner triggered alarm bells the priest had learned to trust. The questions came too easily, too casually woven into conversation. "The Christmas operation was masterful, Father. How did you coordinate the timing across so many locations?" "Your document forger, Dr. Krutokvil, is it? Where does he obtain the proper paper stock?" "Sister Magdalena mentioned safe houses in Smichov. How many are operational there currently?" Father Prohatska answered with careful vagueness, providing information that was either outdated or deliberately misleading. But he noted how Novak's eyes sharpened at certain names, how he steered conversation back to network structure, how he asked follow-up questions that felt like interrogation disguised as collaboration. When Novak left, promising to return with more intelligence, Father Prohatska stood in the empty church for a long time, staring at the confessional where this had all begun. He thought of the Dvorak family in prison, the Baronics in the camp, the 27 people who had escaped on Christmas Eve. He thought of Judas, who had also seemed sincere, who had also asked the right questions. That evening, he sent word through the network. František Novak was to be given no information, no access, no trust. But the damage Father Prohatska feared might have already been done.
Father Prochaska knew they were coming. Every instinct honed over 3 years of resistance screamed the warning. The increased patrols, František Novak's sudden disappearance after 2 weeks of persistent questions, the way Hauptsturmführer Bauer had smiled at him yesterday, not with politeness, but with certainty. The rational choice was to shut down operations, destroy the remaining documents, and disappear into the countryside using the escape routes he had created for others. Sister Magdalena begged him to leave. Jan Kovar had safe passage arranged to a monastery near the German border. But 6 people were currently hiding in the crypts, waiting for forged papers that would arrive that afternoon. The Goldstein family, husband, wife, elderly mother. 2 brothers from the resistance who had sabotaged a railway junction. A young woman whose name Father Prochaska never learned because she was too terrified to speak. He could not abandon them. "Just one more," he told Sister Magdalena, though they both knew this phrase had become his fatal flaw. "After these 6 are safe, I'll go." She looked at him with eyes that understood he was lying to himself. "You'll never stop, will you? Not until they stop you." He had no answer. February 12th dawned gray and bitter. Father Prochaska conducted morning mass for a handful of parishioners, his voice steady through the familiar liturgy. Afterwards, he took his position in the confessional, though he was not expecting penitence. The confessional had become his command post, the latticed screen allowing him to observe the church while appearing occupied with pastoral duties. At 9:47 a.m., he heard the sound he had dreaded for 3 years. Multiple vehicles stopping outside simultaneously, the heavy tread of boots on stone, the metallic click of weapons being readied. Through the confessional screen, he watched Gestapo agents pour through the main entrance, 8, 10, 12 of them, moving with practiced efficiency to block every exit. Obersturmführer Geschke entered last, scanning the church with the methodical attention of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. In the crypts below, 6 people waited in darkness, unaware. Father Prochaska made his choice in the span of a heartbeat. He burst from the confessional, his voice ringing through the church with a volume that surprised himself. "Domine liberanos a malo," Lord, deliver us from evil, the closing line of the Lord's Prayer, but also the predetermined code phrase, "Run, now. All tunnels compromised except south exit." Then, louder, directed at Geschke while his voice could still carry to the crypts, "You dare bring weapons into the house of God? This is sanctuary. You violate." Geschke's nod was barely perceptible. 2 agents rushed forward, grabbing Father Prochaska's arms. A third drove a fist into his stomach, doubling him over. Through the pain, he kept shouting, kept buying seconds, kept making noise to cover the sound of movement below. "The crypt," Geschke ordered. 4 agents ran towards the stairs. But Father Prochaska had bought enough time.
When the agents descended into darkness, they found only empty chambers and 6 sets of footprints leading to a tunnel entrance. The collapse mechanism had been triggered. Tons of medieval stone blocked the passage, and beyond it, 6 people were running through darkness towards the southern exit that opened into a warehouse owned by a resistance sympathizer. They dragged Father Prochaska upright. Blood ran from his split lip, but his eyes were clear, almost peaceful. For the first time in weeks, the calculation was simple. 6 people were escaping. The arithmetic, for once, balanced perfectly. Geshka stood before him, fury barely contained. Where did the tunnels lead? Father Prochaska smiled, tasting copper. To places your maps don't show. To people your files don't name. To a future where you've already lost. The beating began in earnest then, professional and methodical. Father Prochaska endured it without speaking, his mind tracking the seconds, calculating distance and speed. By now, they would be out of the warehouse. By now, they would be moving through Prague's morning crowds. By now, they would be alive and free, and beyond Geshka's reach. He had saved one more. It would have to be enough.
Pankrat's prison stood on the southeastern edge of Prague, a fortress of gray stone where the Gestapo sent those they wanted to break completely before killing. Father Prochaska was taken there directly from St. Wenceslas Church, still wearing his cassock, now torn and blood-stained. The interrogations began immediately. Geshka wanted names, every person in the network, every safe house location, every forger, every courier, every family that had offered shelter. He wanted the complete architecture of resistance that Father Prochaska had built for 3 years. For 3 months, Father Prochaska gave them nothing. The techniques were methodical and designed to destroy both body and will. Sleep deprivation, stress positions, beatings that left no permanent marks but caused profound pain. The interrogators worked in shifts, fresh and rested, while his prisoner grew weaker. They showed him photographs of Sister Magdalena, of Jan Kovar, of Dr. Kratocheville, claiming they had already been arrested, that his silence protected no one. He knew they were lying. If they had captured his core team, they would not need him to confirm identities. When Geshka demanded names, Father Prochaska quoted scripture. When they asked about tunnel locations, he recited prayers in Latin. When they showed him the photographs and promised leniency if he cooperated, he smiled through broken teeth and said simply, "Even Christ had his Judas, but I will not name mine." The prison had its own resistance network, quieter and more fragile than the one outside, but functional. A sympathetic Czech guard, a prisoner trustee who moved between cells, a priest from another parish who was permitted to provide spiritual counsel. Through this network, Father Prochaska sent messages, not operational details that could compromise anyone, but something more important, confirmation that he had revealed nothing, and instructions for the work to continue. His final letter reached Sister Magdalena in April, written on a scrap of paper in pencil so faint she had to hold it to candlelight to read it. "The tunnel still stands. Keep the light burning. My silence is my final sermon." On May 17, 1944, at dawn, Father Antonin Prochaska was taken to the prison courtyard. The execution was carried out by firing squad, 6 soldiers, professional and efficient. He refused the blindfold. When asked if he had final words, he spoke clearly. "Pan Bůh bůd s vámi." May the Lord be with you. Whether he meant the soldiers, his network, or all occupied Prague, no one could say. The death certificate listed his crime as conspiracy against the Reich and aiding enemies of the state. It did not mention the funeral processions, the forged papers, the medieval tunnels transformed into pathways to freedom. It did not count the lives saved.
Sister Magdalena received the news in the crypts of St. Wenceslas, where she was preparing papers for a new extraction. She wept for 10 minutes, then dried her eyes and returned to work. The network Father Prusciakas built did not collapse with his death. Under her leadership, it continued operating for 8 more months until Prague's liberation in May 1945. The final accounting took decades to compile. At least 300 lives saved: Jews, resistance fighters, political dissidents, ordinary people marked for death by an extraordinary evil. Some escaped to safety abroad. Others survived hidden in Prague until liberation. Many never knew the name of the priest who had made their survival possible. For 50 years, Father Antonin Prusciakas remained a footnote, if mentioned at all. The communist government that replaced Nazi occupation had little interest in celebrating Catholic resistance. His story survived in fragments, oral histories, coded parish records, memories carried by those he saved. When Czech archives opened in the 1990s, historians finally pieced together the full scope of his work: the tunnel system beneath St. Wenceslas, the coded ledgers, the testimony of survivors, the letter he smuggled from Pankrat's prison. A man who chose to stand between evil and its victims, who understood that sometimes the only way to serve God is to break every human law, who calculated impossible mathematics and saved everyone he could reach, who died protecting secrets that would have destroyed dozens of lives, and whose silence echoed louder than any testimony. The thread he wove, connecting hope to action, faith to resistance, one life to the next, proved unbreakable after all.
The Czech resistance included numerous Catholic priests and Protestant ministers who used their positions, church infrastructure, and relative protection of religious authority to shelter Jews, political dissidents, and resistance fighters. Churches throughout occupied Prague and the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia served as safe houses, document forgery centers, and coordination points for underground networks. The use of church crypts, funeral processions, and religious ceremonies as cover for resistance activities has been documented in multiple survivor testimonies and post-war historical investigations. The specific tactics depicted, including the use of coffins to transport living people through checkpoints, the exploitation of German soldiers' fear of contagious diseases, and the conversion of medieval tunnel systems into escape routes, are drawn from documented resistance methods employed across Nazi-occupied Europe, though the particular combination and scale represented in this narrative are fictionalized. The Gestapo and SS maintained extensive surveillance of religious institutions throughout the occupation, and many clergy members were arrested, tortured, and executed for resistance activities. Pankrat's prison in Prague was indeed a primary Gestapo detention and interrogation facility where suspected resistance members were held and interrogated. While Father Antonín Prahořka himself is fictional, this story honors the memory of real Czech priests, nuns, and religious communities who understood that faith without action is hollow and chose to interpret sanctuary as an active commitment rather than a passive concept. Their collective courage saved hundreds of lives and demonstrated that resistance against totalitarian evil is both a moral imperative and a sacred duty. The rediscovery of many resistance stories in the 1990s following the opening of Czech archives is historically accurate. Communist-era Czechoslovakia often suppressed accounts of Catholic resistance, and many heroes remained unknown until decades after their deaths. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel. We tell the forgotten stories of ordinary people who made extraordinary choices in history's darkest moments.
These are the stories that don't make it into textbooks, but deserve to be remembered. Hit the subscribe button and join us in honoring the courage of those who risked everything for what was right.